We are stronger together, and the European Union, as a community of 27 countries, is the second largest economy in the world. But at the same time, its citizens are often the targets of disinformation campaigns. Good evening, my name is Maia Mazurkiewicz, and welcome to the Anatomy of Disinformation. The EU's official website says its member states aim to support each other and make things better, easier and safer for people. But the misinformation surrounding the EU's efforts is immense. And there's a reason for that. Every piece of fake news can impact people's perception of the bloc. Russia's aim is to polarize Western societies and sow chaos. If the EU gives its citizens a sense of security, Russia's working to undermine Europeans' trust in the bloc. And it uses everything from organized influence operations to malicious fake news. We'll talk about that and more with our first guest.
Małgorzata Bonikowska, CEO of the Center for International Relations. She is the co-founder and president of Think Tank, a dialogue and analysis center focused on leadership and public communication. As a political scientist and academic, she specializes in international relations and European Union affairs. She was a Fulbright Scholar at Columbia University's School of International and Public Affairs and led the European Information Center at the Office of the Committee for European Integration, developing Poland's public information program about the EU.
Małgorzata, welcome and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Well, we are talking today about the EU and how it's targeted by the different influence operations. So one of the main fake news is that the EU will make us to eat worms. Will it?
Of course not, but that's a very complex issue, as the EU bureaucracy is known as implementing different things people sometimes don't like. The very good example could be with the bottles, drinking water, for example, that the tap has to be connected to the bottle. And this is a real regulation. And we face this, and people just don't like it. They don't understand why this should have been implemented. And obviously it is because of the ecological approach, and plastic, we don't want to use it so much, but in the same time people criticize. So there is this space of criticism towards the EU bureaucracy that if you want to harm the EU, hit the EU, it is quite likely that things like you mentioned, you quoted, could be just put in the air and people would believe, even in the most absurd cases. But this definitely is disinformation.
Exactly, and if we're talking about disinformation, it's obviously communication. Sometimes there is a seed of truth, but very often there is not. And the EU is very much targeted with the influence operations from outside.
Obviously, first of all, we are not one country, so we are in any case a bunch of countries with different feelings, different people, different, even historical issues. So it is quite easy just to mingle into what people discuss. We are a very open society, so everything is in the internet, people comment. So if you just follow, like the Russians do, very carefully, what are the hot issues, what are just the delicate, the sensitive issues between the people, among the nations, they just put the fuel more. They just encourage us to quarrel, to be more divided. And they just give us more arguments to do so. And this is sometimes, very often actually, done by the bots who spread out these kind of arguments. But also, there are real people who just pick up these arguments and just spread out again and add to the fuel. For example, in case of Poland, we are absolutely sure that this massive approach against Ukrainians today, and even against Ukraine, it is encouraged by Russian bots and by the Russian, actions in the internet, and all the sentiments which are in Poland anti-Ukrainian, which, it has certain base for these feelings. Sometimes people observe Ukrainians in the schools, in the healthcare institutions, in the streets, and they have some comments, right? Because we live with Ukrainians every day. But it wouldn't be the case if not the massive narratives which come in the internet against Ukrainians. So mind you, we have to be all very careful not to really follow these kind of narratives.
Obviously, it's all about vulnerabilities of people, but coming back to the EU, what are specific narratives that are being used either from outside or also from inside to influence operations, to bring chaos, to destabilize the EU society? And it's, as you also said, a strong alliance also in the war in Ukraine.
Well, at the level of individual countries, it is always a very important moment when we have elections somewhere, because this is a concrete momentum. Russia wants to destabilize, Russia wants to influence the results of the elections. So every single country is analyzed and the narratives follow the feelings of the people. We were also watching that as far as anti-Ukrainian narrative during our presidential elections recently. But for example, at the EU level, we have a very visible new narrative that the European Union does not want peace in Ukraine. This is not only the narrative the Russians spread out within the EU member states, but they very much spread it out in the US. And we are absolutely sure that that's felt even in the close circles of Donald Trump. And that's also a narrative Russia spreads out in global South countries. Russians stress that Russia wants peace. Russia does everything possible to finish off this war, but Europeans don't have an interest because they encourage Ukrainians. They add to the fuel. We want them to fight because our industries have better deals. So this is one example. And second is also Russia presents itself as a leader of a global South countries. So it presents the war also for the EU societies as a right cause, just to be anti-imperialistic. So it puts everything upside down.
And basically, it's also the case that the EU is being portrayed as weak. Do you think that the fake news, as we saw them, and we discussed about the worms, or there's also like the idea of EU banning the plastic IDs, something that is targeted, exactly, are those narratives being targeted to different audiences?
Yes, but it's also true that the EU is not very strong neither. So it gives arguments because of its way of operating. As I said, it's not one country, so we are not very quick. We are always slower than countries like Russia or the US taking decisions. So this is shown and stressed to the people, even to us Europeans, as a very negative thing, as a sign of a weakness. And also every single discussion which shows that it's not integrated policy, that we don't have one stand. We are not able to decide together, that we have different opinions, different interests. This is very much projected as proof that the West, the European Union, is good for nothing. Maybe the perspective is that it will be dismantled one day. So these narratives, our own doubts, sometimes we also have doubts as far as how the EU is working. That's why we have
doubts about our governments, right? And that's a freedom of speech to actually put them in.
Yes, obviously, but we also add to the discussion, for example, my think tank, we wrote a supplement to Mario Draghi report showing where and how we can reform the EU to operate better. But this kind of perception that the EU is not working very well is not true neither.
But are you communicating this as well? Because we're talking here about disinformation, right, and influence operations that are being put basically in the communication sphere. So what do you think that needs to change in the communication sphere also coming from the EU?
that's another weakness of the EU, that the communication sphere is not very well done. I think we thought it would be very good to communicate only good things about the EU, which is not true because people have doubts then. They take it as a propaganda, just successes. But in the moment we started to communicate less, people have more doubts. So I think communication is our weak spot, and we are able to, spot the narratives put in our public debate by Russia, but we are not able also to answer very well to this dangers. And also, we have to admit, sometimes the EU itself communicates in a very vague way. Well, I think first we have to make a communication much more active, proactive, not just following Russian narratives, just to spread out our own messages. And instead of having just this language, Eurospeak, full of very nice formulas which don't tell people anything concrete, to be very concrete and, show action followed by communication, what we did. Really, what we decided, not about that we are talking, that we again will have a meeting on subject. The EU does a lot of things, but many of these things are not really visible and they are not really communicated very well. While on the other side, we communicate too much about doubts and about the process of discussing. And that's why I think people have this perception that the EU is not really doing much in these very difficult circumstances, which is not really true.
And perception is the key nowadays. So changing the way how the EU is communicating should be at their top position. Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you.
Our story tonight explores how Boris Johnson, the journalist, sowed the seeds of witty fakes claiming that the EU banned carved bananas, and how Boris Johnson, the British Prime Minister, reaped the fruit, Brexit. Let's take a look.
That's it, there we go. Fantastic, there you go, straight with the parcels.
We're going to get Brexit done. It's high time that we had a referendum on our membership of the EU. We haven't had one since 1975.
Here's a showcase of Johnson's most efficient disinformation narratives, which, in 2020, culminated in the UK leaving the EU.
The claim that there was £350 million a week that we would get back for the NHS. And in England, the NHS is close to like a godlike religion. So no one will ever disagree with funding the NHS. In reality, the 350 million figure represented the gross contribution to the EU budget and actually intentionally ignored the negotiated rebates. Farming and fisheries was a big talking point at the time. It's an industry which was focused on, and again, the narratives were that the farming regulations would be removed. Are really easy, again, it's taking back control of our farming, taking back control of our fisheries, but not really having any idea of what that would look like in reality.
I don't think anyone takes Boris very seriously.
And it's precisely Johnson's comedy and Fleet Street punchlines that made his fakes so contagious.
One of the most insidious results of the Brexit success was that these narratives and tactics are now being employed as a template in other populist and anti-EU movements outside the UK.
That includes Poland, which has its own journalist become anti-EU firebrand, Grzegorz Braun, a member of the European Parliament, and, in his home country, the chairman of the ultranationalist, ultra-conservative Confederation of the Polish Crown Party.
The Eurocolchoz is more and more auto-aggressive by Green Deal, Blue Deal, Rainbow Deal, Immigration Pact.
But the difference between Johnson and Braun is that the Polish MEP's Disinformation Act are anything but funny. His antics include an attempt to portray the EU as supportive of Israel's actions in Gaza by disrupting a minute of silence held this year in the European Parliament in memory of Holocaust victims.
Let's pray for the victims of the Jewish genocide in Gaza.
Here in Europe, we've all heard about the EU Green Deal, and a lot of that was disinformation. Our next guest joins us to talk about the influence operations and disinformation that specifically targets European farmers.
Marta Mendel, Vice Rector at the Warsaw University of Life Sciences. She is the former Dean of the Faculty of Veterinary Medicine at the Warsaw University of Life Sciences. She serves as an expert at the Polish Accreditation Agency and an evaluator at the Polish National Academic Exchange Agency. Dr. Mendel is a researcher and lecturer with extensive academic and administrative experience in higher education and international cooperation. She holds a PhD and postdoctoral title in veterinary sciences from the Warsaw University of Life Sciences.
Marta, welcome and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for the invitation.
We're talking today about the EU and EU-related disinformation, where what we see recently, farmers are one of the main audience for such disinformation. Especially in October, we saw in Warsaw anti-EU protests, also with farmers standing against Mercosur. Do you think there was a lot of disinformation behind those protests?
Right. I guess to start, maybe we should differentiate between disinformation and misinformation in this case. So for me, disinformation is mainly the intentional misleading of others with the intention of achieving a specific goal. And that was for sure not the very beginning of those riots that we observed. When we talk about misinformation, and I think that was what we were mostly observing that was spread, it was unintentional repetition of false information. So it means that it's just using of information that was wrongly translated or understood at the very beginning. And this is how misinformation is then circulating in the public. So I think that the latter, meaning misinformation, exceeds very much disinformation in this case.
And it was mistranslated from information from the EU, or what was the case in there?
Well, the informations that we receive from EU are usually quite complex and maybe not well understood by everybody, very easy to manipulate. And what I try to say is that most probably it was just very few individuals who might have manipulated, but later on it was spread in the sense of misinformation. So I strongly believe that it is the media, obviously, and many other channels that are involved in spreading. But actually, the disinformation, it's only probably very few individuals that maybe started at the very beginning. And that's very much for the environmental regulations used for trade policies or, for example, vaccinations policies. And as you mentioned, lately, Mercosur was one of the topics that was also used to actually firstly manipulate, but then spread this misinformation.
So that's the part of influence operations, right? That people just take different narratives that are out there and promote them in their own audiences. So what are the main channels that you see that Polish farmers or perhaps farmers in general in the EU are targeted?
Well, there are different levels of transferring this information. So when the information receives on the very high governmental or authority level, this is actually transferred with the right intention, but then possibly misused or manipulated by those who like to achieve broader targeted. And in this case, we are talking mainly about rural communities and farmers. So the next step is how it is spread between them. There are formal and informal ways of communication. There are regional associations or societies that are certainly involved, but also more and more the social media channels and direct communication with tools like WhatsApp or many other that can reach individuals. So
there are specific WhatsApp groups, for example, for farmers?
Yes, there are also Well, this is firstly transmitted into the to the national level and then spread nationally. What we also observe very much, and what we wisdom very often, is very direct transfer of information between individuals. So even if they have no full information and no full understanding of what they're actually talking about, they spread it and interpreting in the way it's most suitable for them at the moment. What I think is often the very beginning is the lack of context when the first information arrives, and this is why it's so easy to use it dependent on current needs and to manipulate it.
And do you see that there are specific tactics, techniques, or procedures that are directed into farmers? Like, I don't know if there's a lot of deepfakes or AI-generated content.
To some extent there is, but I know, and there isn't the evidence that in many cases it's even not needed, as it's quite enough just to reformulate it, to adapt it to what are the current and regional needs and sentiments to achieve the goals that you target. So bringing some bigger issues like Mercosur, for example, and saying only about the effect on costs of products that might possibly enter to our market, but missing the part of quality and safety is a very good example, actually. So it's really just manipulating on how much of the information you forward and you make people interested in.
And it's also exactly targets the vulnerabilities of people, right?
Yeah, of course. I mean, this otherwise that could not be so well received and then spread.
So what are the main narratives that you also been seeing in terms of the vulnerabilities of the farmers?
So at the moment, there are several topics that are on the agenda, I guess. Still, there is lots of misunderstanding and mistranslation regarding the common agriculture policy. And also the organizations that try to lobby against or for that. There is the issue of fallow land, the Mercosur, as you said, as we mentioned, the use of pesticides, antibiotics in the framework of Green Deal, and then probably we could go on with the list.
And are there specific EU-related disinformation narratives?
Probably the Green Deal is one of the origin of issues that were raised, and then certainly are responsible for lots of emotions and discussions around it. So it's a very comprehensive policy with many implications, dependent if you talk more about the crop production, plant production, or animal husbandry, then of course it has different consequences. But yes, indeed, this is very much on the agenda of the European Commission, and that's what raises so many emotions here in Poland at the moment.
The EU is trying to counter disinformation on many levels. So what role can universities like yours play in combating EU-related disinformation?
Well, first of all, I believe we should position ourselves as a body open for a public discussion, very clear, calm discussion with experts, but presenting different points of view. So there is not only one truth, and I guess that's what we all agree about it. You don't need to follow and agree with all the paragraphs, articles, and guidelines, but you need to translate it in a clear language to the final targeted groups of the society. As university, we should remember that among our students are maybe children of those who arrive on tractors today to our cities. So this is also a kind and a tool to get and to reach those people that maybe look at all of those issues differently. And then, of course, daily education. This is where we are responsible to create the next generation of people with full understanding of the future of sustainable agriculture in Europe, also agri-food systems. So I guess there are plenty of ways how universities could get involved. On the top of that, probably innovations and research in agriculture to transform our agri-systems into more competitive, but also at the same time very, very efficient systems.
Marta, thank you so much. Knowledge is the key, and education is part of the work that you're doing as well. So good luck with this. Thank you for joining.
Thank you very much.
Now let's see how concerned Europeans are about disinformation.
83% of people believe disinformation poses a threat to democracy. 63% of young Europeans encounter fake news more than once a week. 51% of Europeans say they've been victims of online disinformation. According to a European Commission report, the EU and its member states are ramping up their fight against disinformation that aims to destabilize society and democracy, exploit crises, and endanger the lives of Europeans. Stay safe, and don't believe everything you see on social media.
The European Union is a community of values. It's not ideal, but it provides security on the European continent. That's why it's often the target of attacks. So next time you see a catchy video blaming the EU for something, remember to keep calm and think deeply.